here, ready to talk about biases, which was our topic of the week. And you've got Sarah and me. Basically, tired Sarah plus tired Helen equals probably like normal amounts of energy. Like one person coming together with a normal amount of energy. We are splitting the session up. I'm going to do a little bit of why did we cover it? I'm going to do an experiment, everybody, as well. An experiment with you, like guinea pig learning community, about biases. And then I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who has got some ideas for action that can be applied generally in your work to prevent biases from holding you back. So you get kind of action from Sarah and random stuff from me. That is why our little alchemy works. Sarah is useful and I'm occasionally useful. Right, I'm going to get my screen up. Who listened today? Let me know who listened in chat. Head into chat. Did you listen? What stuck with you? Before we give you some sort of our takeouts and our summaries and our ideas for actions, let's hear from you. Head into chat. Did you listen? And what did you learn? Let us know. I'm still distracted by mushroom coffee. Head into chat. Did you listen? What did you learn? What stuck with you? Yes, a nice walk into the office. Like the different biases. Thanks, Jamie. Like the ideas for action. Good. I'll do a bit of a recap. We don't want to kind of repeat all the ideas for action. Obviously, it's on the episode. It's on the pod sheet as well. The learning journal. Great. There's one could do with reflection. Well, we'll do it together today, Steve. So when we are talking about biases, and we had a bit of a debate, we were like, oh my gosh, there are so many biases. I read a book on biases on the beach, genuine story. That's the kind of fun life I lead. And there was I started to get daunted. It had like I think it was called Clear Thinking or something like that. It was like basically a book around biases, like 100 in the book. And I started to read and I was like, oh, I've got that one. And then page 2, I was like, I've got that one. And by about page 20, I was like, good grief. So there are many biases. And Sarah and I, we're trying to differentiate between systemic biases like age, race, gender, like even like intersectionality, when all those biases are muddled together. We're trying to differentiate from those ones, which are huge and big and important, and ones that felt, I guess, a bit more doable for you in your development. So things that kind of hold you back that you might not be aware of because it's kind of unconscious, that it feels like you can do something about on a day-to-day basis. That is not to diminish the systemic biases, but we kind of thought from our expertise was better focused on career development. And actually people like Aviva Wittenberg-Cox are amazing on kind of age, longevity leadership she was talking to us about yesterday, and the 4 quarters of life. She's brilliant for that. People like Sophie Williams, really, really good on things like race and gender. So we kind of thought with these systemic biases, that was probably better as like an Ask the Expert episode. And actually career development biases is probably kind of more our territory. So that's why we kind of focused on the 3 that we did. And the 3 that we talked about, these are the ones that we thought, oh, do you know what? These are things that we see frequently that get in the way of people's growth and that feel like something we can do something about. So the first bias we talked about was affinity bias. So this is where you have a tendency to spend time with and build career communities of people quite like you. And that can be like they look like you, can be they talk like you, can be they think like you. But the idea of affinity biases is they get in the way of your growth because you're kind of operating in a bit of an echo chamber. People have similar experiences. They have similar interpretations of situations. You're not really challenging yourself with new information or new people's perspectives. And that kind of gets in the way of your growth because it stops you being curious. It stops you kind of being open to challenge, kind of keeps you very much in that kind of comfort zone. So affinity biases hold you back. Sarah will give you some ideas for action of things you can do differently. Second one we talked about was confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is where you look for information that kind of reinforces what you already think. So you kind of like, I think this one's quite like, I mean, it's unconscious, but I think it's quite egotistical in a way, because you're like, well, I mean, I don't think that people that are, I don't know, what might I think? Was one of my confirmation biases. Maybe that I would think that people who are very logical and structured in their and very attention to detail people probably aren't going to be people that I would get on with. I'm not particularly logical. I'm not that structured. I mean, I like a matrix, and I don't have attention to detail, but my confirmation bias would kind of look for people, look for kind of things that would support that belief, rather than go, oh, hang on, that's someone who's got an attention to detail, that's someone who's very logical, and I really like them. And so your brain kind of keeps you in its kind of what it already believes. Again, so we stop challenging ourselves, we stop looking for information that could kind of challenge the assumptions that we're making. It happens a lot in interviews as well. Confirmation bias, we might rule people out automatically based on some things that we might believe to be true about them. And then the last one we talked about was recency bias. And recency bias is where information that is more recent to us becomes kind of the thing that we recall most easily. So things like when you do performance reviews, for example, if Sarah said to me, we're like, what was your proudest moment in the last 12 months? I go, well, yesterday we delivered an amazing event as a team, and that's my proudest moment. You're like, oh, well, there were another 11 months to reflect on, Helen, but interesting that you went to yesterday. But it's you know, our brain makes shortcuts, and those shortcuts don't always help us, and they also don't always help the people that we work with. So out of interest, and let me make it anonymous so that you can be as easily honest with us, which one of those biases do you think might get in the way of your growth? Can you put a star on my screen? Affinity bias, you kind of spend more time with people like you, you're building a community of similarity. Confirmation bias, you tend to kind of look for information that reinforces what you already know. You don't necessarily actively, you're not curious, you're not challenging your assumptions. Recency bias, you have a tendency to just recall yesterday or last week rather than January. What do we got here? Sarah has put the instructions into the chat for us. So anyone that is new to PodPlus, hi. And if you head up to the top of your screen, view options, annotate, stamp and star. Sarah has put the instructions in chat. What have we got? Affinity bias. I think Sarah is going to give you a good idea for action for that one. It's easy, isn't it? Affinity bias. Like it feels nice to spend time with people like us, but it's not always great for our growth. Okay. Some good reflections, everyone. Before I hand over to Sarah, I want to do an experiment with you. But Sarah, has anything popped up in chat? Because I haven't been looking through chat while I've been talking.
Are you all good? You can go straight to the experiment.
Okay, everyone. I don't know how this is going to go, but that's the way that experiments go. I am going to clear your lovely stars. I am going to wait. Hold your horses, everyone. I'm going to read you some words. I've got 2 experiments to do with you. I'm going to read you some words, and I'm going to show you some words, and I'm going to ask you some questions. That's all I'm going to tell you. And then we're gonna see what happens. Okay, some words for you, everyone. Are you listening? Ready? Don't want you to see them. I've used my Sharpie for this. Right, some words. Blue, coat, fortune, kick, complex, finance, indoor, budget, cycle, matrix, transform, exceed, hobby, slide. Some words. Let me know in chat, what words do you remember that I just said? Type words out. What do you remember I just said? Right. God. What have we got? Ooh, interesting. Okay. I mean, this isn't going to be very scientific because my brain's trying to catch up with all this typing. Okay. So, okay, I'm going to... Okay. All right. So this is a test. Oh, wow. Onyeka, you're like a robot. You remembered everything. Have you got some AI generator that's just taking the words down that I just said? So interesting, everybody. So this is apparently a test of recency bias. The hypothesis is the words that I said towards the end are the ones that you would recall more easily. So the last couple of words I said were hobby and slide. What I'm seeing, though, is quite a lot of blue was the first word that I said. And so quite a lot of people put in blue. It's interesting. I mean, I'm looking through this. I'm scanning. I can't give you an accurate. There is a lot of blue and there is a lot of slide, I would say. Also quite a lot of hobby. I could do some analysis of that. I've forgotten what it called. Basically counting your words to see what works. But I think the ones that I'm seeing most frequently are hobby, blue, a bit of slide. That's counter. That evidence, that experiment has not worked out as I thought it would. Apparently we're all supposed to remember slide. One more. Let's do one more and see what happens. Matrix connected with me. Yeah, maybe. Right, another one. I'm going to flash some words up on the screen. I want you to look at them. I'm going to do this quickly. So you've got I don't know, 5 seconds, well, maybe 5 seconds to look at the screen. On Yaka's brain's going to be like straight away. She's going to remember everyone. But I'm going to flash 5 words up, and then I'm going to take them away. And then I'm going to ask you another question. Ready? Here we go. Da 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 da. Let me know in chat, what words do you remember? Ha ha, Andrew. No. What have we got here? Pebble Street. Oh, Pebble Street sounds like one of those places that would be in a kids program. Pebble Street. What we've got? I'm seeing loads of pebbles. Car Pebble, Car Pebble. Car Street Pebble, Car Street Pebble. Okay, seems to be car. I'd say Car Street Pebble. That's my scientific analysis. So, that one worked. Apparently, this is primacy bias. So it's different. Apparently, when you hear words, you tend to remember the last words that were said. Recency bias. When you see words, you tend to remember the first words you've read. So you have primacy bias. So this is just interesting, kind of just being aware of it. What does this mean? This means that when you're reading emails or reports at work, your brain will have a tendency to remember the first bits of it, Car Pebble Street, and then you'll probably get bored or kind of forget the rest. That's not great if the gems are at the end, but also put the good stuff first. When you put loads of waffle in reports, if our brains are biased for primacy with written words, then we should put the good stuff we want people to remember first, probably as bullet points. And then when we are talking to people, again, just remember that, it wasn't quite proven with the words that I read to you, but apparently when we're talking to people, what you hear, it's the recency biases at play. So the last things that you say are the things that will stick. So anyway, I will leave you with that thought, just to remember when you're talking to people about how, acknowledging that we've all got biases, sometimes we can make them work for us, primacy and recency bias being an example, if we want what we're saying or what people are reading that we've written to stick. Interesting. Right, Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you.
That book sounds interesting, Jess. Smart Brevity. I already like the title. That's not one I've read, so I'll be checking that one out. This also makes me think, just listening to Helen, thinking about this a bit more, that if you feel like this is something that shows up a bit in your organisation or sometimes in conversations that you're having with managers, and this is not something I'm particularly good at but have got better at, I think, is writing things down. And I actually can think of quite a few examples of where I've led teams or I've worked with people, and you can see they're getting frustrated because of something that they remember, that maybe somebody has committed to them 6 months or 9 months ago, and then nobody's written it down, and they've come back to it because it's important to them, but nobody has sort of written it in a way that they've not communicated it using sort of written stuff. They've just had a conversation, and it's sort of understandable that people forget those conversations. So just in case you see that in your organization, I would always kind of go, just make sure you kind of capture those key points, because I think coming back to key points is a really good way to overcome some of those biases. So I was trying to think this morning, rather than repeat what is on the podcast, you don't need to listen to podcasts to come to PodPlus, but I know lots of you do listen to the podcast. I was trying to think of connecting ideas. So what connecting ideas do we have that would help you to overcome career development biases? What are some of the things that you could do that might even mean you address or overcome or get closer to overcoming 1 or 2 biases from doing them? So I've got 3 ideas for action, which I hope it's not just kind of going, it'll just do the job of 1 bias. Actually, I think it might do more than 1, is my hope anyway. So the first thing I was thinking about, and some of you might have listened to this episode or done this activity with us before, was the importance of having a personal board. Now, we've said before, I never use this phrase with other people. I never sort of say, Helen, you're on my personal board, or more fun, Helen, you're fired from my personal board. I just use it as a framework for thinking about, have I got a range of people around me? This goes back to this phrase of cognitive diversity. So if we are trying to overcome affinity bias, too much sameness, too many people a bit like me, and we want to challenge ourselves to think differently. So maybe somebody can remind us of things that aren't as recent. Oh, but do you remember when that thing happened? Because they know as well. And they can question us and challenge us. If we have got 5 or 6 people around us who bring difference but have you in common, I think that will naturally help you to overcome some biases. So as a quick reminder, if you're in the centre here, a few roles that you might want to consider, and you might be thinking about, have I got somebody who plays this role for me? So have you got a really good questioner, somebody who asks open questions and helps you to get unstuck through the questions that they ask? Sometimes maybe those questions are questions you're avoiding. That's quite helpful for overcome biases. Or maybe just questions that you wouldn't come up with, which will also help you to overcome biases. Have you got a challenger? We're going to talk about devil's advocate in a second. I think these people often play a devil's advocate role for you if you get them right. As a reminder, with a challenger, they don't need to be challenging to the extent where you think, well, actually, there's conflict. We don't get on. What they just need to do is challenge your thinking. Every time I have a conversation with someone who's a challenger, often they just sort of approach the world in a different way. So have you got someone who approaches the world in a different way? Because they will naturally play devil's advocate for you rather than you having to do it for yourself, which can be quite a hard thing to do depending on how maybe critical your brain is. I find devil's advocate quite easy. And I was thinking about this morning as I was going for a little walk to get a coffee. I was like, oh, why do I quite enjoy playing devil's advocate? And I think it's because I've got quite a critical brain. So I quite enjoy both sides of playing both sides of the coin. So we'll talk a bit more about that. Have you got an ideator, someone who could come up with some ideas that you won't come up with? That might stop you having confirmation bias. So I am definitely someone who can be quite definitive in thinking, this is a good idea. Like, I'm pretty confident this is a good idea. Maybe based on intuition, maybe a bit based on data. And I'm quite determined. So once I sort of think, yeah, that's good, I'm then quite determined and focused on that. So I sometimes might need other people to say, well, what about that idea? What about this idea? So keeping me open to not just being like, well, I've already sort of decided that route A is the way to go. Well, what about route B, C, D, and E? And sometimes having someone else to kind of prompt that can be useful. Having an empathizer. This is somebody who knows your world. This is a little globe, knows your world and gets your world. I think they would help with things like recency bias. So if I said I've got a WhatsApp group with 3 friends. And so if I said to them, I'm really struggling at the moment, I don't feel like I'm doing a very good job, they would all know me, and they've known me for long enough that they would be like, has something happened in the last week? And I might be like, oh yeah, this thing went wrong, or I don't think I did a very good job at this thing. They would remind me of all the things that went well in the past, because they've sort of got the memory for me. So, sometimes when you can't go back, you can't do that mental time travel and go back to the past because you're quite stuck in the present when something has gone wrong. Sometimes other people can do that for you. And I often think about conversations I've had with people where, maybe an interview's gone badly, or they've had a really bad conversation or something with their boss. And then because you're an empathizer, because you know them really well and you know their world really well and you've seen them in action, you can help to paint the full picture if they're just seeing sort of a tiny dab of colour that probably isn't really helping them, and is perhaps creating this bias around like, I've done a bad job. And I think supporters can do that too. Supporters are people just on our side, want us to succeed. They think we're like the best thing since sliced bread. And connectors. Have you got a connector? Connectors are useful because, again, they get us further away from people like us. So I think you could look at your personal board, and it's the first time I've thought about it this way, but you could look at your personal board and think, how do I build a board that is going to help me to overcome the biases that we all know that we have? Now, if I have everyone here who is female, that's probably not going to help me. If I have everybody here who used to work at Sainsbury's, like I worked at Sainsbury's, and like I get lots, I can imagine having a board of people supporting me who all had very similar experiences to me. Again, that's probably not going to help me. So you can really start to think about, okay, well, who is a connector who is going to get me out of my world, who's going to introduce me to different places and spaces, versus a connector who is going to introduce me to more people a bit like me. So you've actually got a bit of a choice here where you're thinking about each of these roles. Are they helping you to overcome a bias, or could they actually be reinforcing a bias you've already got? So it's just a different angle to look at your board. I found that quite helpful as a different way of framing it. Next one, let's talk about this idea, as I said, that I quite enjoy, of playing devil's advocate. And I was thinking, what if you are nicer than me? And this feels hard to do. What could help you to do this? So I came up with 3 ideas. One, in any scenario, think about what is the most likely outcome or thing to happen? And at the same time, what is the least likely? So most and least likely. I think that could be quite a helpful question, because your least likely is going to get close to devil's advocate. So I might say, the most likely way for me to progress in my career in the next 12 months is to get promoted in the team that I'm in. That's like the most likely scenario. And then you could ask yourself, well, what's the least likely scenario for my career progression in the next 12 months? And so you're just going, what's the least likely thing? Oh, I would go back to a team that I've worked in before, because I really don't want to do that. I would go and work in a team that I've got zero experience in, because that feels like way too much of a leap from where I am. So asking most and least likely, I think, will get you close to that kind of devil's advocate if it feels kind of naturally a bit harder to get closer to. Or just do opposites. So think about, that point about other sides of the coin. So opposites can be quite helpful. So if your progression is, if you're like, okay, well, I think my progression is about moving into a manager role, ask yourself, well, what's the opposite of that? And it's quite interesting. She's like, okay, what's the opposite of moving into a manager role? And you might be, let's say you've got one person in your team at the moment. You might go, oh, well, moving into a team where I don't manage anyone anymore. And that would challenge you. That is the opposite of moving into a role where maybe you're managing more people. So again, you're just getting to you're just challenging your brain really to think differently. So then you might go actually into a role with zero people. How does that feel? What does that mean? How open would I be to that? And then my last one is, if you do find this really difficult to sort of play devil's advocate for yourself, this is a good coaching technique. Think of 3 people who are very different to you and just ask yourself, what would they do? You can even go and have that conversation. But generally, if I think in some situations, what would Helen do? Often it's pretty different to me. And so that's helpful, just because we've got different personalities and different kind of starting points. Sometimes it's not that helpful because we have very similar values. So Helen by herself is not enough for me. She's not enough of a devil's advocate because we have too much in common in terms of our values and obviously our day-to-day. But she's a good start. So I'm like, well, Helen's a good start. My partner is pretty different to me in terms of, like, for example, never listened to a podcast, never read any of our books, zero interest in career development. So that's always quite interesting. I'm always like, what would Tom do? Nothing to do with career development. Wouldn't be doing this, that's for sure. But good question, gets me to think differently. So just think about, like, who are those people who you're like, well, are naturally devil's advocate because they're just so different from you. So I find that quite helpful, sort of seeing your world through somebody else's eyes. And then building on this even further, I was thinking, what else would help me to overcome biases? Another connecting idea. And I got to empathy experiences, partly because I love this idea and I think it works. Where you feel like you might be most likely to be biased, perhaps with other people, other teams, things that you sort of make judgments on that you can see might be based on bias. How could you go and spend time with those people and those teams to immerse yourself in those worlds? So this is really, I'm going to do a Helen shoe here. Here's a Helen high heel. This is really walking in their shoes. So this is what it'd be like to walk in Helen's uncomfortable shoes. This is what it would be like to walk in my trainers. Here we go. And so if you were thinking about, right, okay, actually, I always feel like that team don't know what they're doing. Or I feel like I don't listen to what that team says because I'm maybe making a bit of a judgment that my way is better than their way because they're very different to me. Actually thinking about, well, what would it look like to spend time in their world? Really easy ones, I think, are going to spend time in other people's team meetings. Just going to someone's team meeting is fascinating. So could you go to a team meeting or like a team day, maybe, if you like know them well enough to be able to do that? Could you have a curious career conversation as like an easy starting point if you wanted to do that one-to-one? So that's more of a one-to-many idea. This is more of a one-to-one. That's sort of not quite an empathy experience, but it's getting closer. You might want to do that before you go and do an empathy experience. It might be quite hard to just be like, oh yeah, can I pop along and be part of your team for a bit? But ultimately an empathy experience is really inserting yourself in someone else's world. So my best example of this was when I did work at Sainsbury's and I was in corporate responsibility, and suddenly I was working with farmers and I knew nothing about farming, like absolutely nothing. And so really the only way, and I could have had quite a lot of biases around farmers. I think farmers could probably have quite a lot of biases about me. Very different, not much sameness there. And also I genuinely didn't know anything about it. The best thing I could do was to go and spend time on a farm and actually just really be there. And I think your job when you're in an empathy experience is purely kind of listening and noticing. So you're not trying to actually be active or add value in any way. Your job actually is almost to be sort of passive, in that you don't want to get in the way. You're there to sort of observe, notice and listen. And sort of you're learning through listening, you're learning through watching, through noticing. I think this works particularly well when there is a lot of friction, because this is time consuming, right? Particularly that last one where I'm really going into empathy experiences. But if I was thinking, Helen and I feel like I want to sort of learn about Helen, and she's very different to me and she works in a very different way. If I just spent a day watching her work, I mean, it probably frightened me and be very, very tiring. But also I'd be like, oh, okay, well, that's how she works with so much pace, or that's how she gets so much done. This is how she works without having any breaks. Like, how does that even happen? It's because of the mushroom coffee. But that would just help me. That would help me to sort of overcome some of those biases by sort of seeing what happens and how it happens. So I'll stop talking now. They were my 3 ideas for action. I often think with the podcast, connecting ideas, and I know I often say this when I pop up in PodPlus, I'm like, oh, how can we connect? But connecting the dots across ideas is really helpful. So when you're thinking about biases, don't just sort of think in a silo, try and then connect with like, okay, so well, what else have I learned that might be helpful here? Helen, I've not kept up with chat, but I know there has been a lot of it.
Most people are just saying that you're really mean and that I should get a more friendly business partner. That seems to be, and they're all like applying. So
maybe they could do some maybe they should have an empathy experience with you first before deciding, would be my suggestion.
I've had a pretty robust. I've had it for like 20 odd years. I'm used to it. Next week, everybody, on the podcast, we are covering 10 quick wins for your Squiggly career. So short, sharp. We've like tackled some big topics lately. Short, sharp.